Alrighty. Thank you for inviting me, by the way. We're moving to another part of the world in this session, at least part of the session. So things will look a little different. Perhaps people look a little different to you. We talked a lot about process today in here, and I just thought I would mention that back in the mid-1970s, when I was working on my dissertation, my committee, my very august committee, was not convinced that the Aztecs were an empire at that time. And my biggest uphill climb was convincing them that this was an empire. And that was, well, I like to think it's not that long ago, but I guess But at any rate, I hope you'll be with me on this, that this is an empire. I really don't want to go through that again. As you can see, I'm trying to, what I'd like to deal with today are just two sort of basic things. And one is the relationships between expansion and conquest and trade. And to see what those dynamics are, I'm very interested in the process of them. So, if I can, what am I doing? Why can't I do it? Yeah, I'll stuck. See, I'm talking about process here.
Press the right arrow. Simply press the right arrow, that'll move you to the next slide.
Yeah. That's right. Oh,
Right, yeah.
oh, wait.
You got it.
Okay. Okay, now it'll work? Okay. Okay, thank you, sorry about that. At any rate, two things, and two sort of just very basic kinds of ideas here. One is that conquests create borders, and I'm actually overstating that a little bit, because with the Aztecs, when they conquered individual city-states and just basically just sat their border on top of that. They didn't expand beyond those. And trade and markets create networks. These are basically lines, or as we talked about earlier, nodes and the relationships between them. And so we've got both of these things going on here in the Aztec Empire. This is a generalized view of the empire's territorial extent. And then the trade was going on all around and about that. Since we are in a different part of the world here, I just thought I'd set the stage a little bit for you. We're dealing with latecomers. These guys were the last of the great civilizations to come into Mesoamerica. So they already had a lot of stuff, and of course, our friends, the Aztecs is really not the right word. Mexica is really what we're looking for here, as far as the people who established the great city of Tenochtitlan. There are a lot of ethnic groups, but Aztecs we use as a term that's very well established to sort of talk about the collectivity of these Central Mexican peoples. So the Mexica, our friends, the Mexica wandered down over a couple of centuries into central Mexico. They established a city of, their capital city of Tenochtitlan in an island on a lake. The very famous picture, of course, this sits on the Mexican flag today. And they inherited a great many things already there. So they didn't invent a lot of extra stuff. But there was already a lot of city-states dotting the landscape. The political foundations were already there. The dynasties that were centered in these city-states, they were actually the core of the city-states, fine fellows such as this fellow here, were already established. Warfare was endemic. And people conquered one another. You had conquest states going on, very volatile military kinds of activities. You had trading networks that were very ancient in this area. Markets, well established by this time, some of them very large. Elite marriages to establish alliances, feasting, political negotiations. All of these things that were basically the core of building an empire were already there when the Mexica came in. They did do a few things, though. One thing they did was they established their city of Tenochtitlan, the capital city, by 1519. When the Spaniards arrived, that thing was about 200,000 people, maybe 250. Enormous, and 10 to 15 times larger than anything in its vicinity. So all the other cities were really much smaller. It was just like a great big ulcer there. And basically Mexico, this lake has since been drained. Do you like my drawing? That's not the drawing. has been drained by the Spaniards back in the 16th century, and Mexico City sits on top of all of this. That's why anytime you put a shovel down in your backyard in Mexico City, you come up with something fabulous. Right? But you had this enormous city. You had the enormous marketplace that was basically attached to that city. 20 to 25,000 people attended it daily. Perhaps 40,000 on a 5-day schedule. An enormous market. The Spaniards visited it when they showed up, and one Spaniard said you could hear the noise from the market from a mile away. So this was a very vibrant economy that was going on, and a very high level of urbanization, at least in this particular city. Now, to gain territory, to gain prominence in their quest for power, the Mexica, who lived here, Tenochtitlan, this is this duck-looking thing, weird, right? It's a lake. Mexico City and its neighboring cities really cover all of this today. So here's Tenochtitlan, and it forged an alliance in 1430 with 2 cities here on either side of the lake, which is a very smart thing to do, because each of these groups controlled ethnic groups on either side, right? And each had their own political domain. So once they forged this Triple Alliance, they really had a very powerful coalition, which we call the Triple Alliance. And that Triple Alliance then moved outward from this basin of Mexico, which is right here where the little star is, and over only as you can see here, well, anyway, up there, about a 90-year period, managed to conquer enormous areas in central Mexico, and in fact, right down here, as far as the Mexico-Guatemala border. It was the largest empire that this region had seen in all of prehistory, and it was only done in what one may say, about 3 generations only. So a very rapid kind of expansion. Also, the other thing, we're in another part of the world from a lot of you. There's no beast of burden. There's no practical use of the wheel. Everything's on foot or by canoe and over very rough terrain. So you have to consider that as another kind of level of achievement here, that this was done with those transportation kinds of things. So this is the setup here. And I'd like to look at just 2 issues, just briefly here. And one of these is the dynamics of imperial expansion. How did they do this? So I've got 3 little questions here. What was the nature of the boundaries themselves, fuzzy or not? Right? How were the boundaries established, and were there limits to imperial expansion? Everybody always asks me, if the Spaniards hadn't come, how far would have these Aztecs gone? Right? Would the empire not just been brought to an immediate halt? So these are the kinds of questions that we can ask of the imperial expansion. By the way, if you take a look at this guy, I always love this guy. To me, he's proof that wealth and power do not necessarily bring happiness. Look at that guy. Yeah, well, so much for him. So what did these boundaries look like? Actually, for many years, there was a map that showed this all as contiguous territory done by Robert Barlow, and then in 1986, Mike Smith and I and other people did a summer conference at Dumbarton Oaks, and we basically redid the map. We worked from the bottom up and basically reconceptualized how these guys conquered their domain. And the first thing I came up with is that the empire was not contiguous at all. Basically, you conquered city-states, individual city-states, and that was your empire. But all the space in between, that's the space in between. Right? This is not areas that you control. These are grouped together into provinces because we have tribute lists that group them into provinces. But these provinces weren't established all at once, like I conquered these city-states, bam, they're in a province. In fact, they evolved And in a number of these places, city-states became tagged on to provinces as time went along. So if you look at the empire in 1460, you look at it again in 1500 and again in 1515, it's going to look differently as far as the arrangements go. There were different strategies that were used here. These darker provinces were outright conquered. You pay tribute, it's basically straight out exploitation. These other ones, you'll see there's some other ones that are lighter colored along here, particularly out around borderlands. We've called these strategic provinces. Provinces, again, is not a word that's perhaps the best word, but they're like client states, if you associate them, say, with the Romans or whatever. It was a very cheap way, really, for this expanding empire to hold a border against enemies, to hold and control trade routes by making deals, basically, with other people. You don't have to conquer them outright. So you make this arrangement, make a negotiation. So you have those, and they pattern geographically in a very interesting way. They're sort of holding these borders. You do also have a lot of unconquered enemies. The empire was not invincible by any means. They had a disastrous campaign against the Tarascans over here, after which they established these borderlands. The Tlaxcalans over here, you probably know, they helped the Spaniards when the Spaniards came, so they were a thorn in the Aztec side, and they would come down here into some of these areas. They sneak across those borders and incite rebellions against the Aztecs. So they were kind of pesky little critters there. And the borders themselves were in constant flux, so that's one thing. You know, they're not only do you not necessarily know when you're crossing a border, but they're constantly fludging around, depending on rebellions, which were fairly frequent, especially when any of these areas detected any weakness in the core areas or in the imperial stance, say a change in rulership. There were different rulers had different priorities. One ruler, he just went all into very, very expansive areas, conquered outlying areas. The last ruler, Moctezuma, spent most of his time just consolidating and size. So they had different approaches. There was a difference in the types. Yes. Okay. Difference in types of provinces. One is in the interior areas you have a set of provinces that bought into the empire, and they helped the conquest. On the outside, you had straight exploitation. You also had imperial responses to internal consumption needs. The population was growing, so you needed more bulk goods. At the same time, the nobility was increasing, and you needed luxury goods such as feathers, turquoise, cotton, and cacao. And over this 90-year period, there was an increase responding to these needs in the basic tribute quantities, and also in terms of getting more luxuries. These feathers, gold, turquoise, greenstones, all came from the later conquests, which were also the more distant conquests. And there were limits to imperial growth. One emperor going down here had a lot of trouble with rebellious troops and couldn't go any farther. The same guy later on came down here and was asked to go further, but he said, no, my troops are exhausted. I can't do it. Okay, now just briefly here on a second issue, the relationships between tribute, which is imperially imposed assessments, trade, and markets. And the one point I really want to make here is that this is your IRS form, your tribute form. Some of the goods were locally available. This is a province deep in the south. Cacao, jaguar pelts, and feathers could be obtained locally. But there are things on this list that were not locally available. Amber, gold, and greenstones. They had to be obtained from much farther away. And this was obtained through trade, which was much more ancient in this area. Another province, this province up here in the Gulf Coast, gave turquoise and greenstones. Those things are not available by any means. In fact, they're from very distant areas. The turquoise itself, either coming from the north or, interestingly enough, from the south. We have records of trade in turquoise coming from the south, but not local by any means. So trade networks are continuing here. Tribute in feathers and feathered warrior costumes. One example here, these kinds of headdresses with these big flowing quetzal feathers. The feathers themselves were from these areas here. But the people who had to give these costumes with these feathers on them were from all over here, where the feathers were not native. Where did they get the feathers from? There were trade networks. These trade networks went across borders, and they were not necessarily mediated. In fact, they weren't at all mediated by the central powers. Right? So there's all this side trade going on among these groups. I'm going to pass that one up because we're going to. But the really point I want to make here is that you've got these trading networks. They're using markets to trade elite and everyday products, and indeed trade was stimulated by tribute because tribute required you to in fact get things from outside your own area. And the more tribute they imposed on you in this way, the more you had to continue your trading. So these things were not separate things. They were in fact related to one another. And my time is up. So I will.
Those guys who didn't pay their taxes in the middle of
Oh, these guys, oh, no, these are, of course, I'm in a bit of a hurry at the end, I apologize. These are merchants. There were professional merchants that were, that had trouble getting across the borders. One thing I would mention ahead of time. You can see they had a lot of trouble in this case. The higher you were in the echelon of say, merchantry, and especially these professional merchants were attached to and associated with the polities, with the powers that be. They were spies sometimes. They carried the ruler's goods. They had a lot more trouble getting across the borders. This is one of these border crossings. It's, by the wall in Mexico. So they had more trouble. But your everyday guy carrying some dyes or some corn or some wood or whatever from one market to another that crossed a polity border, they would have no trouble at all. So there were these different sort of levels of how intense the borders were depending on how intense you were in your trading enterprise. So yes, I will.
Thank you.
I know I